Sarrera Londresen daukagu. Vale? Eta Carolynn. Hi. Hi.
Oh.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay, bueno, engotzet sarreratzu eta ja zuzenien beragaz joango da. I'm gonna introduce you.
Thank you.
Yeah, because I can't see you. You're on my back. That's why. No problem, it's okay. So, Carolynn Steel is a leading thinker in the fields of food and cities, but she goes further. She argues that food shapes our bodies, minds, homes, habits, cities, countryside, politics, economics, and climate. In short, just about everything that matters to us. She is a London-based architect and academic, and her award-winning books, Hungry City, How Food Shapes Our Lives, 2008, and Citopia, How Food Can Save the World, 2020, have been translated into 15 languages. Her concept of Citopia, which means place of food, has gained international recognition in a wide range of academic, design, industry, and arts fields. Carolynn has taught and lectured at various universities around the world, and she is an excellent speaker and communicator, as we will have the opportunity to enjoy. There is a lot of information about her on the internet, and especially in her books, so it only remains for me to thank her heartily for her participation, and wish you bon appetit for this nourishment for the soul. So, thank you so much. Go on, Carolynn. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
in modern life, we're really divorced from the sources of our sustenance. It's, you know, a long way away, often the farms and the people that feed us, and we don't even think about them often. And I call this the urban paradox because basically it goes back to the duality that I was just talking about, that the Greeks recognized between our social needs on the one hand and our natural needs on the other. And of course, if we move more and more into cities in order to maximize our social potential, the further and further away we get from our sources of sustenance. Now, as ever, I've got 20 minutes and I'm already way behind, even with a short talk. So I'm just going to briefly say that looking at the historical city is very interesting because it shows us how powerfully cities were shaped by food. I mean, I've just drawn up these maps of London. If we think about the way food was traveling into London, we can see most cities in the pre-industrial world were surrounded by market gardens, by fruit and vegetables, because it was very difficult to transport them very far. And again, if you think about the problem of feeding a city that the Greeks thought about, problem number one is how do you grow the food? And of course, farming was the answer to that, and critically grain. But problem number two is how do you get it into the city? And the short answer to that question in the pre-industrial world was by water, because it was much cheaper and easier to transport food over water than over land. So grain, which is the yellow map here, which is very heavy and bulky in relation to its value, would be coming in mostly by river into a city like London, coming into the main river ports, and then traveling through the city to the place where it was traded at Cornhill. And of course, Bread Street tells you it's being traded on the way. Fish would obviously come in also by river, but animals were walking into the city, and therefore they would be coming from a completely different direction. So it's fascinating to look at maps of old cities because we can see the powerful relationship between geography and the city and the sociability that surrounded food. And again, just very, very briefly, you know, the power of markets in the pre-industrial city, because the market was the only place you could go to get fresh food. They were often the only open space in the city. They were often in the middle, or almost always in the middle of the city, and everybody went there. So they were natural places of sociability, of politics, you know, and also of protest. So these really are the sort of the beating heart, if you like, of the food system in the pre-industrial city. And I'm obviously going through vast amounts of very, very complex stuff very quickly in this talk, but I'm just trying to sketch in the bones of how powerful food is as a tool shaping our lives. Of course, all of that changes with the railways in the 19th century, and the reason is that it's possible for the first time to transport food long distances rapidly. And this really emancipates cities from geography. So we see three key changes at this point. The first is that cities grow a lot bigger. So this is really the beginning of the urban age. The second is that this is the point at which food starts to become invisible to people. And the third is that politicians who've been mostly in charge of feeding people up to this point, which is an almost impossible job and they absolutely hated, by the way, they then sort of wipe their collective brows and say, thank goodness I don't have to worry about that anymore. And they hand over responsibility to the food companies that now feed us. So if we look at that physically, we can see London, for example. When the railways come, it's almost the same size as the medieval city, but it very rapidly grows into this great metropolitan, sprawling mass that you couldn't possibly just feed from one or two markets in the middle of the city. So we see the deregulation of the food system. We also see the transformation of the productive hinterland. So this is the transition from small family farms of the kind we saw in medieval Italy through to vast industrial farms of the kind that now dominate. And of course, the railways made it possible to transport grain from areas like this and then start feeding the grain to animals. So we see a complete shift from hunter-gatherers, Native Americans living with bison on grassland, to the slaughter of the bison, the removal of the Native Americans, the creation of a grain glut, and then the creation, if you like, of so-called cheap food. Of course, it's not cheap at all. But it appeared to be cheap at the time by feeding grain to animals, to cows, which they are not, did not evolve to eat, but they will eat, but it makes them sick. So it's kind of a crazy system. Of course, the consequences of this were immediately visible. The sort of ecological destruction done by changing grassland over to monocultural production, which gave rise to the conversation that we're still having today about whether we should farm chemically or organically. Hugely fascinating and important conversation that I really don't have time to go into, but suffice it to say in a headline, organic is the only way we can feed ourselves sustainably. And in fact, the organic people were winning that argument, and then war came along. And of course, this is the point when we went decisively down the chemical road. And that we're now in post-war. I'm just trying to sketch how we got to where we are now, when of course everybody drives rather than walks, huge use of fossil fuels, walks around in a sort of ice box, which is a replica of the city. And of course, food itself is completely denatured in order to withstand the logistical pathways that it now has to travel. I mean, just to reiterate, we've predicated our idea of a good life on cheap food, which doesn't exist, and we've done it by externalizing its true costs. And we all know some of them, maybe not all of them. So degraded or lost farmland, climate change, huge use of unrenewable resources such as water, 2 billion overweight, 1 billion undernourished, diet-related disease, zoonotic pandemics, huge amounts of waste, feeding grain to animals, which is incredibly damaging, spending a huge amount of energy, and the decline, massive decline in bird and insect life caused by chemical farming. So it's a disaster, it's a catastrophe. You probably all know that. And unfortunately, it's going global because, of course, the politicians handed over responsibility for feeding people to the companies. So basically, the global food system is now predicated on making profit rather than on what's good for people or the planet. So what are we going to do about it? Well, I love this quote from the English architect Cedric Price, who said technology is the answer, but what was the question? I think it's brilliant because we've used technology to get a lot better at, as it were, extracting food from the planet, but we now realize at great cost. So what was the question? Well, it hasn't changed since ancient times. It's still the same question. How do we eat? How do we live? What is a good life? How do we balance our lives with nature? How do we create a good society? In other words, how do we share with one another? And of course, it is the great utopian tradition to ask these questions. The Greeks started it. Then Thomas More wrote his famous book, Utopia, in 1516, saying that London was getting too big and we needed to go back to a whole series of semi-independent city-states. So the Greek model, the fried egg I talked about earlier. And Ebenezer Howard is exactly the same idea, his garden city idea, but using railways to link people up so you get enough density of population. The problem with utopia, however, is that it's a joke word. It can either mean a good place or no place. And now I can explain why my word, utopia, food place, is in Greek, because it's a food-based practical alternative to utopia, because food shapes our lives, as we've already said in the introduction, our bodies, our minds, our cities, our landscapes, our politics, our economics, our climate, and so on. And, so we live in a world shaped by food, but we live in a bad Sitopia because we don't value food. So the whole idea of Sitopia is that if we use food as a lens to see through and understand the world through, and we revalue food, we can create a very, very good Sitopia, which is quite close to utopia. So very, very quickly, because time, as usual, is flying away from me, the idea is that food is a flow going through our lives, the landscape to a distribution center, maybe a factory, a market, our kitchens. It's often already been cooked in the UK. We, of course, eat, but often now not even speaking to each other, just looking at our phones, and back through the system it goes. But of course, it's much more complex than that because every stage of that journey is affected and affects every other stage. So we're looking at a hugely complex system that shapes everything in our lives, which reflects our culture, our values, our habits, our knowledge, our social bonds, absolutely everything. This is food's power. Of course, at every stage of that journey, we've got choices. Do we feed grain to animals and make them sick? Or do we let them eat grass, which is why we co-evolved with cows in the first place? Do we leave the city to get food, or do we use food to animate public space? Do we take time for food? So If I tell you that 1 in 5 meals in America is now eaten in a car, that gives you some idea of the degree to which we don't value food. Or do we remember our roots and remember that actually sitting around the table and bonding and sharing food is ultimately what makes us healthy and happy and secure? And of course, the answer to all these questions is basically not which of these individual things make sense in itself, but which actually feeds into our vision of a good life. So it's kind of turning the whole thing on its head. There is no silver bullet solution. You'll hear people talking about, oh, the answer is, kind of Soylent or protein made from sunlight or all these kind of technologically based ideas. But I think it's fundamental to remember that as humans, one of our great capacities is our diversity and our ability to adapt. And therefore, we've learned how to live well in a remarkable diversity of places. And so local food culture and local knowledge and local wisdom are critical to our ability to live well in a particular place without expending a lot of energy, which of course is critical, going to be more and more critical in the 21st century. As I say, it's about valuing food. Food is the most, obviously, the most valuable thing in our lives. Without food, we die. Food is life. There is nothing more valuable. But it's ironic that society tends to remember this only when there's a crisis. So during wartime, or as in Cuba at the fall of the Soviet Union, or Detroit after the cars left, and so on, people immediately went back to growing food. So I think there's a real clue here to the fact that we need to recognize that we are in a global crisis of this kind, and food is the answer. If you learn or believe, as I do, that a food system and a society map directly onto one another, it becomes very obvious that a food system that looks like the one on the left, which is what we've got at the moment in Europe, can't work, where farmers and consumers are separated by supermarket buyers who are super controlling and powerful. It's a monopoly. So what we need to do is we need to join the branches to the roots in order to re-democratize the food system. I love this concept of Carlo Petrini's, the founder of the slow food movement, who talks about co-producing. This means we're not just passive receivers of food, but we actively take part in feeding ourselves or helping those who feed us to do it, such as in a community that supported agriculture farm like this one, or working in a food co-op. This is the oldest one in America, 50 years old, where the members of the co-op work in the shop, and it looks like a supermarket, but it actually isn't. It's just a food hub that buys food directly from farmers with long-term contracts. Farmers can increase their power by creating co-ops among themselves, of course. Or cities can provide institutions like the food courts of Singapore that allow small-scale family firms to operate within them. I'm an architect by training. I should have explained that, but maybe it's obvious from the way I think. But of course, planning for food in the way that we design cities and the way we design the countryside and bring those two things together is critical. There are many, many amazing examples of this, of preserving peri-urban farms like these ones in Kenya, incorporating food into city policy thinking, creating food hubs like this one in Canterbury in the UK, protecting local abattoirs, because if we're going to farm with animals, and by the way, I think we do need to, because we need to go organic, hugely complex things. I'm just literally skirting over like headlines, but it's all important to have it all in the same conversation. Protecting markets like this one in Paris, or indeed the artisanal producers. And it's amazing that in the UK now we have more artisanal producers of cheese than in France, which I still find difficult to believe. But this is what happens when you value food. Of course, we need to move to nature-friendly ways of producing food. We can do this. The maths prove that we need to do it, but we need to eat a lot less meat and dairy, but not cut it out altogether. And that's because you actually need animals in the system, because what you're doing when you're farming organically is you're mimicking nature. And there is no, as Albert Howard said, the father of modern organic farming, there is no natural system that doesn't have animals in it, because they help to circulate the nutrients. But we can stop tilling the soil, which allows the plants to grow, the living bonds that give the plants their nourishment from the soil, mimic forests, shift our diet, and have much more diversity in the landscape as we farm. What I'm building up towards arguing is that we need to move towards thinking about economia 2.0. We need to base our economy on food. This means basically internalizing the true cost of food production. This will mean that all food, I mean, basically very damaging food like livestock production in factories, factory farming effectively, will become completely unaffordable, which it already is, but we're just paying the costs outside the shop, not within the shop. And it means that artisanal, local, seasonal, organic food will cost the same as it now does, because it's the only food that doesn't externalize its true costs. But of course, this means we also need tax reform and land reform, because my definition of a good society is one in which everyone can eat well. So we need to rethink the landscape, bring the city and the country closer together. There are many models of how to do that: preserving the countryside, reintroducing productive land into the city, interrogating local hinterland, seeing what could be produced, or incorporating food growing into new urban models. I call it creating landscapes for human and non-human flourishing, because that's effectively what we need to do. And there are many amazing examples. Again, these are all from the global north, but there are fantastic examples from the global south. But of course, the global south is on a slightly different part of the curve. I'm actually involved in this farm in London. This is my last slide. So basically, the idea of Sitopia is that food shapes our lives, and it's the most important thing in our lives. And we're all engaged in what it represents, which is effectively a system. And if we retool our idea of a good life towards creating a society in which everyone can eat well, and we revalue food and internalize the true cost of food, then the market will start to work for us and not against us. And we will also start to see that there is a vision of a good life that is about primal things that we need to flourish: good health, strong societies, a sense of identity, of meaning, of belonging, of high levels of individual skill that used to belong to our ancestors, our indigenous ancestors. And we've just lost sight of it because we've been pursuing an idea of a good life that doesn't exist. So basically, this thing, food, this bowl of food, it's your lens to the world. But if we value it and we create a better world through it, then we can create a really good Sitopia, which, as I say, comes very, very close to utopia. And that's a very, very quick version of of my work. But thank you very much for listening. If you want to know more, I do have these two books, and they are both translated into Spanish, if that's any good for you in Bilbao. Thank you so much. Can't hear.
Hi again.
Hi, yeah, I can hear now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. They were clapping, but we weren't on time switching on the mic, but there were claps a lot.
Thank you.
So by now we don't have any question written, but maybe you want to ask her directly, because we have this little time. Per time, not very spare, but I mean. So is any one of you willing
We
to?
have one.
Okay, we have one.
There it goes the mic.
There it goes the mic.
Zuzen inglés esan gutza. Baina ez da, mikrofonotik ez da bentzutzen? Vale.
Thank you for being with us. Two questions. The first one, what are you growing? Like in your back, like what are you growing? What food are you growing actively?
Oh, am I growing food myself?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I live, as you can probably see, in the centre of London, so I don't have much space, but I do actually have a little roof on the way up to my flat, and there I grow cucumbers and tomatoes and herbs and figs. And figs. I mean, basically that on my roof. So, and I do find it very interesting because I've never grown anything in my life until a few years ago, and then I got access to this roof, and it's amazing how it changes your perception. I find of time. I mean, what I didn't say in my last slide is that slide I showed you is that, you know, the fact that we're sort of, as it were, on a planet spinning through space, which obviously gives us, you know, day and night and seasons and so on, is something that living in a city, as I always have, you can be very unaware of. But when you're growing food or plants of any kind, but particularly food, you become really aware of it, because your whole, even if you're only growing small amounts of food, your whole year becomes, oh, I have to decide what to grow this year. I have to find the seed. I have to renew the soil. I have to look after the plants. If I go away, somebody has to water them for me. And of course, when you harvest it, there's always too much at once. So you have to then learn how to pickle or to make jams and chutneys and things. So I find it really interesting. And I think, thank you for asking the question. I mean, I think in terms of, if we're talking about people's right to food and people's access to food, I think giving people the right to grow their own food or access to growing their own food is a really, really big part of that. And of course, people, again, it tends to be people from the global south who come to live in Europe still to do this, but actually people in the north have often lost them. Certainly in the UK, very few people these days grew up growing food. And I think it comes from this kind of familiarity. So I think it's something very, very important to reintroduce, even if you're not producing all your own food, which certainly I have not been, but I mean, it teaches you the real value of food. And I think once you've watched a little plant grow from seed and then grow into this great hairy monster that's producing lots of fruit, it changes your relationship with food, and you understand it a lot better.
Thank you. And you also you answered my second question about like access to growing, but thank you.
Thank you.